Well, good afternoon, everybody. There's been a lot of emphasis and discussion on soil health and cover crops over the last few years. So today this webinar is going to focus on soil health management systems, or the planning principles and conservation practices that work together to enhance soil health. It will also provide you a background on using NRCS conservation practices to develop a sustainable system that promotes soil health. We're fortunate today to have as our speaker David Lamm. Probably most of you know David already. David is the team leader for the National Soil Health and Sustainability Team, which is located at the East National Tech Center in Greensboro, North Carolina. Just on a personal note, we've had Dave out to Ohio many times to talk about soil health, and he has a real gift for being able to put the issue of soil health into the perspective that producers can relate to. David is a native of Marion, Ohio. He's worked his way up through the ranks of NRCS, serving in many different positions over the years. He currently has over 30 years experience with NRCS, but I really think that he's found his niche with soil health. It's something that he obviously enjoys. So as Holly indicated, David is open to taking questions throughout the presentation, so feel free to type those in. And when David's able to catch a breath between slides, I'll try to interject your questions there. So without further ado, David, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, Mark, I'm bringing up my presentation now, so I apologize for the time it's taken to get that. And I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar. Generally, you hear my voice at the other end when doing what Mark does, but I do have excited about being here and sharing my ideas and what we're trying to advocate through the use of soil health management systems. But the first thing is really, why are we even talking about this in 2013? And there's some really compelling drivers behind the emphasis behind soil health. And the first one being the fact that in less than 40 years, folks, there's going to be another 25% more people on the face of the earth. World estimates are there's going to be over 9 billion people. And these 9 billion people are going to need something to eat. And that's going to put a tremendous responsibility and challenge to the agriculture, not only here in the United States, but across the world, to increase the food and fiber production 50, 60, 70% on the same amount of acreage or less that's being available right now. You think about it, we got another 2 billion people going to come. They're going to have to live somewhere. So some land that's being used for agricultural purposes is no longer available. So, and a good estimate of that are looking at what happened here in the United States between 1982 and 2007, where we lost 14 million acres of prime farmland to non-returnable usage. And then this whole idea of energy demands, I get confused myself. You know, I didn't realize until I was preparing for this presentation that over 40% of the corn that was produced in the United States last year went for ethanol production. And this increase in production requires an increase in inputs. You know, use of anhydrous ammonia is up 48% in the last 10 years. The use of urea and other forms of nitrogen is up over 93%. That's a tremendous amount of increase. And the fact of the matter, folks, this increase has been brought at an energy expense. Not only we're using our corn to produce our ethanol to drive our cars, but also that same corn is requiring 30 to 35,000 cubic yards or cubic feet of natural gas to produce a ton of various forms of nitrogen. So it's kind of a unsustainable future if you look at it that way. That's why we're talking about it today. So when we're talking about soil health, the definition that we like to use is this idea of the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And that definition's got three really key components. The idea of continued capacity. We want our soils to be able to produce continuously in a sustainable fashion in the future. That's very important. And the idea of it being a vital living ecosystem. I wonder how many of us this morning when we walked across our lawn, going to the office, that we thought about that, whatever was underfoot, is that a living ecosystem? Most of us don't think of it that way. And then the idea of soil functions. You know, what are those soil functions that we expect to get and are needed for agricultural production? That's a key there. Most farmers, and I'll say this many, many times, that they have an acute knowledge and awareness how a piece of steel goes through the soil, but they have very, very little understanding about how soils function and the actions that they're taking through management, whether it be application of fertilizer, tillage, all those things that they do. They have very little understanding of how that affects how soils function. What are those functions that we expect soils to do for us and help us raise our food and fiber? First one there is nutrient cycling. We need to have our soils efficiently cycle nutrients, whether it's something that we've applied synthetically or whether we're trying to get a little extra boost by managing our soils in such a way that it's providing nutrients by the way we're managing. Both are very, very critical. The second thing is we want our soils to hold water. We don't want water running off the landscape, getting into our water, our streams, our rivers, and our waterways. It's more important that it's soaked through the soil, and as it's soaking through the soil, that it holds on to some of that. So we want our soils to provide infiltration, and we also want them to have water available for that June, July, August period when crop production is so key and water demand is so high. The third thing is the idea of filtering and buffering. We expect and we demand our soils to break down those products that we apply. We hope that they help break down biochemically or pesticides or what have you, help to accelerate that half-life so they don't stick around and linger for a long time. And the fourth thing we expect out of our soils is to provide a physical stability and support. And by that, I mean we need to be able to cross our fields without rutting them up. As a district conservationist, so many years ago, one of the strongest selling points I can remember to farmers about no-till was the fact that they liked it in the fall when they were harvesting. It gave them a firm foundation. I didn't remember redding the field up. And think about that, folks. In a one-year period of time, soil resilience is so important that it was able to sustain or keep farmers in a better condition as they were harvesting their fields. A huge selling point. But that last one, the idea of soil as a habitat for biodiversity, I can guarantee you there's probably not one person out of 10 out there that would have thought about that as being a significant soil function that we need to support through these soil health management systems that I'm going to be talking about. So the idea is, as we develop these systems, we need to make sure that we contain practices and activities that address all of these soil functions so that we can have a vital living ecosystem. Some clarification here. Soil properties there's really two types. There's those that are inherent. Those are the ones that, such as soil texture, type of clay, depth of bedrock, drainage class, those types of things. We really can't do anything to alter those through this emphasis on soil health and the implementation of soil health management systems. What we're talking about is those things that are the dynamic properties, things that are affected by human decisions and activities that are done to the landscape. Organic matter, biological activity, aggregate stability, infiltration, all of these are affected by the decisions that farmers make on a day-to-day basis on how they manage their land. And that's a huge difference. So the reason I bring that up is we can't expect everybody to have 10% organic matter in the soil or 5%. You need to look at the landscape that you have in your surrounding areas. Go out to the woods. Go out to the prairies that haven't been disturbed. What's going on there? That's your goal. That's what you should be striving for in your particular location across the country. So, here's my first poll question, Mark. Let's see how this works. If it's true, you put the thumbs up, and if it's false, you put the thumbs down. So providing habitat for soil microbes is one of the primary functions of agricultural soils.
Okay, go ahead and select your thumbs up or thumbs down at this time.
I kind of like this, Mark. Most of the time we're answering questions, and it's very rare that I get to respond and ask questions out to the audience there.
Well, actually, I'm not seeing the icons change on here. I'm still seeing the heads, so that doesn't appear to be functioning as we thought it would, Dave.
Okay. Well, let me keep going, and maybe we can make a correction as we go. That's what we love. And we think that managing soils is a challenging thing. Okay. Before we move into developing systems, we really need to have a good, solid understanding of soil health planning principles. And so I'm going to go through the four that are the drivers behind those practices that we've selected to be kind of combined into a soil health management system. The first one is managing more by disturbing soil less. Second, use plant diversity to increase diversity in the soil. Grow a living root throughout the year and keep the soil covered as much as possible. Let's talk about the first one. Why is managing more by disturbing the soil less so important? Agricultural disturbance destroys soil organic matter. That's just a fact of life, folks. We've known that for many, many years. Although there are different periods in history that have questioned the value of soil organic matter, it's unrefuted right now. That is key to building soil health. The second thing is it not only destroys organic matter, but it destroys the habitat for the soil organisms. If we destroy habitat, above ground when we're managing for wildlife, by having bare soil, what have you, we're going to drive the wildlife in one direction or another. It's the same thing below the ground. If we destroy the habitat for the soil microbes in which they try to survive in, we're going to have microbes down there, but not going to be in the balance, nor those beneficial organisms that we're seeking to create a habitat for. We need to think about managing our soil so we can create a non-hostile environment. A hostile environment means non-beneficials thrive over beneficial organisms. And there's basically three types of disturbance I'll talk about. There's physical, there's chemical, and there's biological. Now let's run through those real quick. Physical disturbance is basically just tillage. Anything that does any kind of soil disturbing activity, whether it be plowing, chiseling, what have you, deep ripping, anything like that has a tremendous impact on the soil. Here's a good example of what happens. We have a soil from, I think this is from Iowa or somewhere in the Midwest, where they went out and they measured the organic matter in the soil, soil at 4.3%. And then they checked in the field adjacent to that who had been 17 years of continuous monoculture soybeans. And look at the organic matter, 1.6%. That's 60% less. Unfortunately, folks, that's a tremendous loss, but that's not atypical for across the country. That's the average. Not only have we lost a huge percentage of our topsoil, along with that went this valuable organic matter, 62%. And also, the photos up above there, you can see how the difference between the slaking that took place on the soybean, there's no organic glues, there's no structure, there's no aggregation to hold that soil together when it's placed within has water rushing in on it, as opposed to the well-aggregated forest soil. What happens to that organic matter? What happens to all that crop residue? If you're raising 150 or 200 bushel corn, you're going to have, 4,000 or 5,000 pounds of residue easy. What happens to it? Here's another study done by Dr. Roskowski several years ago that shows within the first 20 minutes after a tillage operation or use of a V-ripper or something like that, look at that spike in CO2 release. CO2 is a measure of respiration. What we've done is stimulate those bacteria, those copotrophic bacteria in the soil. They're having a pig out, which we think lasts for a long time, but look what happens. Within 6 hours, that CO2 respiration has gone back down almost to where it was with no-till. The big flush of our carbon dioxide, 60, 70, 80% of our carbon dioxide has been released into the atmosphere. That means carbon going up in the atmosphere is carbon that cannot go into the soil, replenish the organic matter. Again, a huge, huge problem. Let's pick on the grazers a little bit. Here's a typical, I'd like to say this is a typical EQIP contract. We've done a good job focusing on the stream there in the middle. We fenced it out, put a nice stream crossing in there, and we got 2 watering facilities. Now, how many of us would walk away from this particular slide and say we've accomplished the mission, we've addressed the resource concerns? That's not the case, folks. Biological disturbance through overgrazing with livestock is equally detrimental to soil health. While it doesn't necessarily invert the soil, it has causes many of the same issues. Soil disturbance stimulates weeds. Why are weeds? You think about it. Weeds are the first plants that come in. Ray calls them the first responders. In an evolutionary process or an ecosystem that's going back or trying to strive to get back to a steady state condition, weeds are the first things that pop up. That's because a plant, and we consider a weed, puts most of its energy into reproduction, putting out seeds. Look at the Palmer amaranth. Was it 500,000 seeds per pound? That's because it wants to come back next year. It's not putting any energy into roots, any energy into being a sustainable plant. That's why weeds are a problem. That's what happens when you overgraze. Increases weed population, diminishes that whole fungal biomass and the spores in the soil. You drive it from a fungal-driven system to a bacterial-driven system, reduces infiltration, seals it off, increases soil temperatures, diminishes the habitat for soil microbes. You've created a hostile environment because you mismanaged how you let your cows graze on there, goats, or what have you, sheep. And it increases, as a result of this actions, it increases the necessity for synthetic inputs such as fertilizer, pesticides to control those weeds. Biological disturbance could be equally a problem. And then we all know about chemical disturbance, over-application. I'm going to emphasize this. Over-application, misapplication of synthetic materials such as pesticides, fertilizers, and manures can cause a tremendous amount of problem. When used properly, following a program of such a nutrient management strategy or something like that, it can help, but it's the misuse of over-application. So what kind of practices does the NRCS have? We have no-till and cover crops. We're all pushing that big time, tremendous benefit and minimize soil disturbance, don't get me wrong. But also equally as important is this idea of nutrient management and pest management and prescribed grazing. You know, we need to implement these things as a system and not as an independent practice. That's the key. It's a system and not an independent practice. Let's talk about proper nutrient management for a second. You know, we all know about the 4 R's, the right source, the right time, the right place, and the right rate. I like to submit the 5th R. That's the right soil. We need to be building our soils that are regenerative, and so that when they're mineralizing, microbes are mineralizing the organic matter in the soil, we can kickstart that. Normally we're looking at a 2 or 3% mineralization rate. Healthy soils can bump that up to 4 or 5%. You think about that. Mineralized, normally we can give 20, maybe 30 pounds of nitrogen credit per percent organic matter. Just think if your system's functioning enough, it's been regenerated enough, that's up to 4 or 5%, then we're talking 120, 150 units of nitrogen that can be available under normal mineralization in a healthy soil. Let's talk about proper integrated pest management. You know, this whole idea of let's don't jump all the way down to suppression before we start worrying about things. Let's go through the steps. What can we do to prevent pests from occurring? Crop rotations, resistant varieties. What can we do to create an avoidance atmosphere? You can use trap crops. We can create beneficial insect habitat. We can incorporate those in there. We can use monitoring to establish economic thresholds that will help us evaluate whether it's worth going to that suppression technique, which is supposed to be the 4th step in the process. Again, it's a systematic approach that includes all of these. All right, Mark. Did we have any success with the first poll question?
Well, Tanya is suggesting a solution to it here. So let's go ahead and try your question, then I'll give them some guidance on. We'll see if we get show up this time.
All right. The second poll question is: soils can be disturbed by physical, chemical, or biological activities. Is this a true or false statement?
Okay. Tanya suggested at the top of your screen you'll see a participant button that if you press that at the very top and choose emotion, and then you can select okay, agree, or disagree with that. So let's try that and see if we get some our responses to take effect this time. So if you agree with David, go ahead and read your question again.
Soils can be
disturbed by physical, chemical, or biological activities. True or false? So again, if you go to participants, choose emotion, and then see if you can get your icon to change there.
Are we getting some better success this time?
Actually, no, I'm not. I'm still not seeing any changes. So we're going to have to work on that for next time.
Okay. Well, we're just going to. It's a good idea, but let's keep moving. All right.
I do have a question, though. If you are willing to question.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's the question is why do you feel a system of practices is more effective than say just no-till or cover crops by themselves?
Well,
getting at this idea of why is one practice not as effective as, say, 2 or 3 combined?
Well, what we find, Mark, is that when you implement things as a system, you get a synergistic approach or benefit. 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2 anymore. It's the whole concept of one benefit multiplies on top of the other. And it's not quite as clean as just, say, we can't put necessarily a value on it, but again, it's the synergistic effect that's created by implementing all these principles. And again, a good example is the idea I can tell you about residue. We used to go out and I'd talk about how the benefits of residue left over from a corn stalk or something like that and be there for years. Look how good. That corn stalk's been there for years. Well, folks, corn stalks are not supposed to stick around for years. They're supposed to degrade. They're supposed to be decomposed in a healthy soil. They're being incorporated into the soil. And so if it's laying around, that means, yeah, I'm no-tilling, but my biological activity in the soil is very poor. Residue shouldn't last from one year to the next. That's the point. So you got anything else you might add to that, Mark? Or?
Well, I kind of like to liken that to, a filter strip. We can put a filter strip out there as a standalone practice, and it may be very effective for a while, but, unless we're looking at other practices in the field upstream of that, we're quickly going to overwhelm that filter strip with, nutrients, sediment, that type of thing, and it's going to lose effectiveness. So that's kind of a good example where, adding additional practices, as you said, it has a synergistic effect. They complement one another, and they end up being more effective than if we just would have put out, the single practice by itself.
Okay. Well, I'll keep going unless you have another question.
No, that's all I got at this time.
Okay. All right, let's talk about the second planting principle, this idea of increasing diversity in a crop rotation. Why do we do that, or what are we talking about? We're basically talking about growing more plants, more species in the same rotation period. So if your rotation's 3 years and you're growing 3 crops, is there a benefit to trying to kick that up to 6 or 7 or 10 different plant species in that given period of time? Why do we do that? Well, it increases soil organic matter, one key. It breaks pest cycle, improves nutrient availability, nutrient cycling, those types of things. It also provides windows for management activities to occur, being able maybe to spread manure at a time of year that's more beneficial or has less negative effect on the environment, that type of thing. So those are some reasons to buy it. But folks, we need to understand it's more than just planting more plants. It's planting plants that, again, work synergistically to improve the soil biology. We need to understand that plants have an interaction with microbes. They trade sugars, they trade carbohydrates, they trade proteins from their roots, from the plant roots, and they send out these exudates, these chemical signatures into the soil. And when they're doing that, they're trying to attract a specific variety of microbes in the soil that benefit them. They're saying, microbe here, I'm going to send you out this cake and this ice cream, these proteins, these sugars, and I'm going to try and get you to come and establish yourself around my roots. And in exchange for that, those microbes provide water. They can provide nutrients. They can provide the concept of mineralization, and immobilization takes place in that rhizosphere that's immediately adjacent to the root. That's where they're converting the plant material into organic matter. So it requires a diversity of carbohydrates, a diversity of these plant exudates to support a variety of microbes. And a system that lacks that is driven to favor some microbes more than others. So, and then again, and a good indicator of that is disturbed soil. Soils that have had a lot of physical, chemical, biological disturbance tend to be dominated by bacteria, and they tend to be dominated by bacteria that fall into the non-beneficial side of the equation. The diversity of bacteria in a non-agricultural field, in a woods or a prairie, can be up to 20 to 25,000 different species. We find in a agricultural field that's been disturbed, they're down there about 1,500 to 2,000. So again, it's the habitat we created, whether beneficial or not, that allows those to flourish. Again, biodiversity is the key to success. Lack severely limits any cropping system. And in a fully functioning system, you need nutrients and energy to drive the system. And I think many of us, I know that folks out there saw the movie Super Size Me. It's kind of a silly explanation here, but the whole premise of that movie was a gentleman decided he's going to live on McDonald's food for a month. He had his chemical blood work done. weight, everything was impeccable. By the end of the month, his blood work went to pot. He gained weight. His doctor was begging him to get off of that. And you think about what's the story there? By continually feeding the microbes in the soil the same exudates from the same 1, 2, or 3 plant species, you're going to severely limit the diversity and the number of microbes that could be potentially beneficial to the plants. So we talk about mimicking nature, mimicking native ecosystems. What do a prairie or a steady state forest have in common? Well, they have a diversity of plants. They have plants that we would fall into broadleaf or grass plants, or you'd have trees. So what we try and do is establish a simplified plant classification system based on plant morphology and based on their growth habits, whether they grow cool season or warm season. So let's talk about how that will work. So cool season grasses would be those plants that's called corn, millet, Sudan, or those are warm season, excuse me, Sudex and sorghum. Those, and broadleaves would be alfalfa, soybeans, buckwheat, chickweed. The classification for cool season would be your cereal rye, barley, triticale, those things. And cool season broadleaves would be canolas, your clovers, your vetches, your turnips, your radishes, and those types of things. So what we're trying to do is look at your rotation and see where in your rotation you're missing these plants. Where are you missing? Your rotation should have all varieties. You should have every warm season grass. You have cool season grass. You have warm season broadleaf or cool broadleaf within your rotation. If you're not, then you're not getting the biological diversity in the plant exudates that you're putting into the soil. So what's the role of diversity? It allows you to look at cropping periods and rather years. Now, we're not naive enough to think that the best thing in the world is for everybody to start raising 3 or 4 years of hay at the end of the rotation. Well, that's not going to happen. We know that. If it was a good thing, everybody'd be doing it right now. So we're limited to that 2 or 3 or 4 years rotational cycle that takes place in your neck of the woods. Down here in the South, it's cotton peanuts. Up in the Midwest, it's corn beans and wheat, something like that. So by looking at ways to divert or insert these different species into those tight rotations, we don't have to look at a year, but we can look at a window. What can we squeeze in between the corn and the soybeans, or the soybeans and the wheat, or the wheat and the corn? Those types of things. So we accelerate the rejuvenation process in the soil health. And the other thing we need to think about is this idea of how do we measure success when it comes to a cover crop. We tend to want to measure biomass, don't we? We tend to want to brag about, well, I got 10,000 or I got 12,000 pounds of biomass, which is a good thing. But we tend to neglect the fact that, or overlook the fact that if a root is growing in the soil for 6, 8 weeks, they're putting exudates into the soil. They're stimulating a particular microbe that if that plant wasn't there for a 6, 8, 10-week period would not get the benefits of that carbohydrates and proteins and sugars they're putting out there. So we need to think about that. If a plant's only grown for 6 or 8 weeks, that's good enough. It's adding value to the system. That's one of the keys behind a diverse cover crop mix.
Got time for a quick question or two, David?
Yeah, go ahead.
One question was asking if you could repeat the number of pounds per percent of nitrogen as a component of organic matter, the percent organic matter. I think you had pounds of nitrogen per percent of organic matter.
Okay. Well, a lot of the a lot of the labs in the Midwest and across the country are starting to give what they call an estimated nitrogen release, or how much mineralization is going to occur. And generally it's about 20 pounds per 1% organic matter. That's just a standard, simple mineralization rate. And it's a conservative. It can be, depending on the biological activity in the soil, it can be ramped up, but they're not going to stick their necks out and say that. They really feel comfortable with 20 pounds per 1%. So you think about it, you got a 3% soil, that's 60 pounds. Previously, if your crop needed 160 units of nitrogen, now they're saying you're going to get 60 of it from the soil. So you'd have to supplement that with 100 pounds of anhydrous urea or something like that. That make sense?
Well, thank you for that. And Karen's asking, warm season plants don't always establish well up north. Do you have any recommendations when cold season plants dominate. So what you talk about the four phenotypes, warm season grasses, broadleafs, cold season grasses, and broadleafs. I guess she's asking, what would be a good warm season crop for those that are up north?
Well, again, I'm not talking about warm season grasses in the sense of native prairies. I'm talking about annual plants. We're not going to go out and seed some switchgrass or something like that. So, things like, you could use corn, you could use millet, you could use Sudex. Those would be all things. You think about a farmer's got a bag of corn seeds sticking around, hasn't used, or bin run beans or something like that. We tend to put our cover crops in a very narrow window. But all plants produce exudates. All plants provide benefit. Now you're saying, all right, Lamm, you just told me I'm raising corn all the time and you want me to use corn as part of a cover crop, so that might have been a poor example. But there are some out there, sorghum. We need to look at some more non-traditional. But I'm talking about annual plants, not perennials. So if you got anything experience up in Ohio, Mark, that would add to that? Or?
Well, a lot of it, too, would depend on, as you say, corn would be a good season grass that would substitute in there. If you're growing corn, you might not need to supplement that in a cover crop mix. And if you're taking off wheat, say, for example, and you could go in with a sorghum sedan grass and get that established early, get some benefit from that, just realize that your warm season plants are going to, they're going to die as soon as the first major frost hits. So
yeah.
If you're going to plant those up north, you need to get them established earlier, like perhaps after a wheat crop.
And that would be the reason to have a diverse mix. This whole idea of, I've got some I know is going to last 10 weeks, and I got some that's going to last throughout the winter. So practices that help address diversity or cover crops, and of course a conservation cropping rotation would be too. But we need to also think about some of our buffer practices. We got 6 or 7 or 10 different buffer practices that while they may not address the individual square foot of cropland, they do, if planted to the right species, can provide beneficial insect habitat, pollinator habitat, and do those kind of things that would help support what's going on in the field. So they can be a critical part of that. I'm going to skip my poll question here and go into this idea of growing a living root throughout the year. This is something, you think about it, folks, the sun shines 365 days a year. There's, most of the year, there's some kind of potential for respiration, some kind of biological activity to take place. Photosynthesis could take place. Limit the amount of solar energy we can trap in our soil by the fact that we raise crops that grow for 100 to 110 days, something like that. Why are growing living roots so important? It increases the microbial activity, influences mineralization, increases plant nutrient uptake. All these good things I've listed here are accelerated by the fact that there's a root in the ground year-round, putting out exudates, stimulating particular variety of microbes, saying, come on, come and get it. I took this information out of Russell. I like to tease about Russell, but I'll refrain from that right now. This is a good idea example. Here, where the green line represents a corn plant. Plant it 1st of May, harvest, stops growing. You got to think it may take a longer time to harvest corn, but in all practical purposes, it quits growing after 100 to 110 days, 114 days, depending on the variety length. So it puts on about maybe 900 to 1,000 pounds of root mass in that top 4 inches. You look at soybeans, it's putting on about 450 pounds when it's actively growing in that top 4 inches. Of course, there's a lot more roots going down below that, but not much. But then you look at a hairy vetch rye combination. You plant it September, let it grow. Over 2,000 pounds before you terminate it to plant your corn. So look at that. That's over a ton of biomass, of root mass, of living roots, putting out exudates, stimulating soil microbiology, all that good stuff. In the top 4 inches. That's over a ton right there. That's why we're talking about trying to keep a living root growing throughout the year. How do we do that? Well, you can lengthen your rotation, add wheat or another crop to make it that way. We can start looking at varietal selections. Everybody, man, we need to plant the longest season variety possible. Well, maybe that's not the case. Maybe we need to have some research into choosing varieties that are shorter but still have high yield potentials. And again, we only need 6 to 8 to 10 weeks of a cover crop root growing to be able to do that, or to provide benefit. And the idea of interseeding, we're so focused on planting the cover crop after the harvest, maybe there's techniques that we can interseed the cover crop while the crop is growing. Why would we do that? Being able to establish something, that's what I like to tease about this, is a blinding glimpse of the obvious, folks. We put a cover crop out, you let it grow longer, it's going to get bigger. That doesn't take rocket science to figure that out, does it? Here's a hairy vetch planted on July 17th, a picture taken in October compared to hairy vetch planted on June 29th, not quite a month, but look at the biomass difference. Here's a study that supports that, done in Pennsylvania. Again, the light blue was planted in early or late August. The dark blue was planted in late September. Look at the biomass production. Again, you got more growing degree days, taking advantage of that sunlight, all that good stuff. And same thing translated into the spring. So how are farmers doing that? This is what's interesting. If we can convince farmers this is a good idea, they'll make it work. Aerial application, that's nothing new. What's new to it is the use of GPS, making sure you're in the right field, that's good. Making sure your overlap's correct, that's really good stuff. The guy in the upper right-hand corner, you think about that, corn's tasseling out. You got a guy with a high boy sprayer. He's got drops on that sprayer. He's seeding his cover crops as he's going. That's getting in there into August, 1st September, getting that 3 or 4 or 5 week jump window. That cover crop's not going to cause any problem while that corn's drying down. Down in the bottom left-hand corner, we got defoliating cotton. The guy's got a broadcast seeder at the front of his sprayer, sending out the seeds, defoliating again 3 or 4 or 5 weeks ahead of time, getting that jump in the fall, allowing that cover crop to come up. And then the last thing, you guys think, oh, that's kind of silly. What's he doing there? That's a lawnmower blade, folks. Again, he realizes that corn's done. It's drying down. That part above the ear is providing no benefit to the corn. So he went in and mowed it down. And in the meantime, I don't show the broadcast seeder. He's chopping his corn off, seeding at the same time. Again, that's a radical idea. But this is what farmers, once they learn that this is a good idea, they'll figure out strange techniques like this to make it happen. Interseeding of, a good picture of interseeding of annual ryegrass, which is big in the Midwest. Benefits there. And again, I'm going to skip my poll question. You got any questions for me, Mark? I'll take a break.
Yes, I do. Actually, several. There's 2 or 3 that concern the use of kind of taking credit for the nitrogen from the organic matter that you talked about. They're being concerned that also uses carbon, and so by crediting the nitrogen, removing the nitrogen through plant that the plant needs, we might also be reducing the organic matter and the carbon in the soil. Can you speak to that?
Oh, well, that's an interesting. Mineralization is a natural process. It's part of the process, and plants convert residue into plant material. You think about you got a protozoa eating a bacteria. They have to consume so many, and it's through that release, that waste product of consuming that bacteria, that other microbe. That's when the mineralization occurs. So the carbon, I think it's a protozoa, it's like a 30-to-1 CN ratio. If it eats a organism that has a 13-to-1, something like that, so they're going to eat more carbons than they are than the nitrogen they need. So that's where the nitrogen gets released. The carbon is actually tied up in the biomass and the microbes, so you're not degrading or losing carbon to the atmosphere. I mean, there's a little through CO respiration, but most of it's tied up in the bodies of the plant organisms or the soil. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Another question here. With the realization that most of our food crops are annual plants, the question is how do, this combination of food crops, which are annual, and cover crops, which are annual, how does that kind of mimic natural ecosystems, which the question is, say, dominated by perennial plants? In other words, the concern is we're trying to mimic a natural ecosystem with annual crops when the natural system's actually predominated by perennial crops.
Well, that's a great observation, and we can. The bottom line is we are trying to mimic those ecosystems. You look at a steady state ecosystem, you go out to a forest, you go out to a prairie. What are the characteristics that make them resilient? What are the characteristics that allow them to function, allow nutrients to cycle, allow water to get into them? And this is an all-day discussion, folks. But basically, we're looking at diversity. We're looking at low disturbance. Those are the two keys. So can we mimic that? Yeah, we can mimic that. Will it be potentially or equally as stable as a long-term prairie or forest or longleaf pine or some community like that? No. But it's those principles that we're trying to mimic, not necessarily the utilization of the same plant materials. So, again.
Okay, there's a couple more questions here, but I think we've got it's about 12 till, so okay. I want to make sure you're able to get through your presentation.
Yeah.
So continue on, and we'll see if we can take some more questions.
Okay, let's talk about keeping it covered. We all know the benefits of cover. Residue, keep it on the ground. We've been pounding people over the head since 1985 Farm Bill with that. So I want to talk about that with the exception of soil temperature. Cover reduces soil temperature, just a tremendous thing. Here's a snapshot, and so a lot of folks have seen this, where you have cover, where you have shade, soil temperature is 87, where it's exposed, and look at that little residue behind there. So it takes more than just leaving a minute amount of residue on the ground to keep the soil cool. Why is that important? Look at this, folks. Anything below 95 degrees, most of the moisture that's available to the plant stays with growing plant. That's huge. Anything you hit 95, 100, 105, most of the moisture goes to keep just for survival, goes through evapotranspiration. We're just keeping the plant growing alive. There's no vegetative growth taking place. And then we can hit temperatures in the soil that can actually start to kill off the microbes in the soil. That's why soil temperature is important. And the other thing to keep in mind, it can be 100 degrees in the soil and only be 90 degrees in the air. It's that intensive sunlight that's hitting the soil that causes that soil temperature to warm up at that 1 to 2 inch depth. The other thing, I'm going to go through these real quick because I do want to show a soil health management system. But here's important, and remember that for every 1% organic matter, that should be a half acre inch of water. That's about 13,500 gallons of water or something like that. So every 1% organic matter equals about a half an acre inch of water available to that plant in that critical time of the year. I'm going to go past this. And then the other thing about organic matter that's important, why I want to keep it covered, there's basically 1,000, for every 1,000 pounds or every 1% organic matter, it's 10,000 pounds of carbon, 1,000 pounds of nitrogen, and you can see that. This is where that mineralization comes from. That doesn't mean all that nitrogen is available, but it means it's in the soil that can be potentially tapped into and utilized in a healthy system. So, I'm going to go past this, Mark. Now, these are the 4 principles. Now, how do we incorporate that into building up a system? What is a soil health management system? Folks, it's just a collection of conservation practices that focus on maintaining or enhancing soil health. We're trying to utilize our existing NRCS conservation practice standards because they're good. They've been through a venting process, and they're updated periodically, those types of things. And the key to the system is it is a system. It incorporates those practices or a combination of practices that address all of the soil health planning principles I talked about. And so it has to be implemented as a system. If it's not, then you're not going to get the full benefit. And the other thing is it's farming enterprise specific. Now, by that I mean if you're raising corn and beans, you may have one collection of practices, and where if you're raising cotton and peanuts, it might be another. And if you're in the West raising vegetables, it might be another. So it's crop or farming enterprise specific. So I looked at our practice standards. This is something what you do. Folks, there's 161 different practice standards out there. That's pretty interesting because it's kind of overwhelming. You think, we got all these practice standards. How many? How come there's going to be too many combinations? Well, not really, folks. Out of the 161, 97 of them, the engineers have the lead on. So that tells me if an engineer is doing it, it's probably not a soil health building practice. No offense to the engineers, but that's just the way it is. Of the remaining, there's 21 that the state agronomist or the national agronomist has the lead on. 13 are primarily for erosion control, and 4 of them are for residue management. And then the grazers only have about 9. So we've reduced this 161 down to about an assortment of about 25 to 30 different practices to start to build these systems from. So what we've done, and Mark and some others across the country have helped put this together, we've kind of came up with a philosophy that we're going to identify some must-do practices. These are the key practices that achieve the greatest impact on soil health. They address the planting principles, they're cropping specific, system specific, and they have that synergistic effect that gives us the largest return. That's what we're looking for. And folks, if I could talk to you one-on-one, you could probably tell me what these practices are. Most of the time, it's going to be conservation crop rotation. It's going to be cover crop. It's going to be no-till system. It's going to be nutrient management, pest management. Once you get beyond those, you're probably moving out of those must-do realm. The second category are those practices that are on an as applicable basis. That means those are ones that are addressing resource concerns that may not occur in all fields. They're kind of site-specific, such as irrigation water management or some of the buffer practices that I mentioned earlier. And then there's the last category is this whole idea of new technology that doesn't fit anywhere in our standards yet. You know, conservation standards move along at kind of a snail's pace, so to speak, but technology doesn't. So they do improve soil health. Some good examples are controlled traffic patterns, huge in the Midwest, reducing the impact of compaction. Precision application of nutrients and pesticides, getting variable amounts based on the soil condition needs. Use of flotation tires. Those are all activities that we would consider best accepted new technologies that may or may not fit into a practice standard. Here again, talk a little bit about controlled traffic pattern. I've spent years as a DC trying to combat compaction in the Midwest when I was up in Indiana, and this is something that's come along to help do that. Okay, so the cropping system specific, and we've developed some templates, and I'm going to try and go to one right now. Tab. Oops, that didn't do it. Here's an example from the Midwest. Hey, I got lucky there. What we've done is gone in and put together a template.
David, your poll question is still showing on my screen.
Oh, is it? Oh, I know what I got to do. Hold on, I'm sorry.
There you go. That's how you see it, Mark?
I'm still seeing it. All right, yeah, it popped in now.
Okay. And I apologize for going fast here, folks, but basically what we tried to do is develop templates with the expectation that states would take this concept and apply it at their level. So here's an example from the Midwest in which we've got a typical corn-soybean rotation or corn-soybean wheat rotation. The primary soil health resource concerns in this is Indiana, Ohio, Michigan type of thing. You got compaction, you got erosion, you got loss of soil organic matter. That's what we're trying to address by this cropping system, the soil health system. So we're saying the basic practices, the must-do practices are crop rotation, residue management, cover crop, nutrient management. And then within each one, we say, okay, you need to address the quality criteria for cover crop would be, the general criteria, it's got to be growing in a planned sequence. We also say that the crop rotation has to have a positive organic subfactor, those types of things like that. We also say for this particular one, in addition to meeting the general criteria, they need to meet the criteria to improve soil organic matter and increase biodiversity. But then here's the key part of it, this specific criteria. How do you make this work within a system, recognizing that you have to be a realist too. We realize that folks are still going to grow crops, and so I guess we can't be perfect all the time. I guess what I'm trying to say here. So we're looking at specific criteria that the rotation must include plants from 3 of the 4 different crop types: the warm season grass, warm season broadleaf, that type of thing. The second one they decided was a practice is considered applied when most beneficial crops for improving soil carbon is planted. So those are for the rotation. Down here for the cover crop, or for the residue management, the 329, the no-till. They're saying that they had to meet the general criteria, meet the criteria for soil organic matter content, and then they have to do this on 75% of the crops growing in the rotation. It talks about tillage can be used only for crops where no-till is not feasible at this current time, such as sugar beets, potatoes, and so forth. They have to keep a stir value of less than 30. So again, those are the criteria that the folks from that particular geographical area of the country decided to emphasize for this system. So, Mark, you got any comments on that? I might switch over to another example if you want to add anything to that, or if you have any questions you would like to ask.
There's actually several comments and questions that we're probably not going to have time to answer, so I'm going to see if there's a way I can save these, and maybe we'll be able to answer them offline.
Well, why don't we go ahead and just get started with questions, and then we've got some time left here, and just see where that takes us. But that might be more beneficial than me running through another example on this. So.
Okay, there's a couple questions that deal with drainage water management and how that fits into this realm of soil health.
Okay, well, drainage water management is I'm pretty weak on this. As my understanding is a system that is, you try and disrupt the natural or the installed drainage system. You allow the soil to stay saturated. You create an anaerobic condition. So you don't get nitrification and those types of things. So I think it's probably has some places, but I would be, you think about getting tens of thousands of millions of acres, that's probably got some limitations. I don't know. You've probably actually got more experience with that, Mark, if you want to comment on that.
Well, it certainly has its place, particularly when you think about very flat areas that you can get quite a bit of drainage behind. I do think it's definitely got some benefits, say in the Lake Erie Basin up in our state in Ohio. But and there's different types of structures that are beneficial that are being researched as to their effectiveness. But yeah, they certainly have a place. I think there's a lot of practices that have places here. The ones I think you were emphasizing are kind of the key ones that we really are kind of a must-do in most cases to get this to work for us.
My concern, again, thinking about we're creating a habitat for microbes to flourish, and my only concern about that type of a practice, and I think it's something really needs to be looked into, is this idea we've created an anaerobic-aerobic situation, anaerobic-aerobic. And it tends to be our microbes that cause us the most problem, disease, tend to flourish under anaerobic conditions. So we're creating an environment in which we're almost encouraging those microbes that we probably don't want in the soil to survive. And the other thing I guess I would be concerned about is this idea of when you go anaerobic, what's the main process that the world enjoys that's an anaerobic process is fermentation, and you can produce alcohols in the soil, and plant roots do not like alcohols. It's like less than 1 part per million or something will discourage alcohols. So it doesn't take much. So I think we need some really good research into the impact on the biological community by going from this saturated to non-saturated, anaerobic to aerobic conditions. So if I'm not a big fan, that's probably because I'm not a big fan. So anyway, what's the next question?
How long does cover crop need to be in place in order to receive benefit?
Again, I think if we get them in there 6-8 weeks, you're going to start to receive some benefits from those plant exudates that go into the soil. Now, you're going to get 10,000 pounds of biomass? No, you're not going to get that, but you are going to get benefit. And the other thing to remember about cover crop roots is they all have different rooting depths. Some root shallow, some root deep. And even in that time, especially like annual ryegrass, it doesn't put on, compared to the biomass it produces above ground, it puts on, quite a bit more root mass below ground. So again, we need to think about, that aspect of things. Just a period of time, you're introducing new exudates, you're stimulating microbes that have been starved for years, maybe have gone into a hibernation type of mode. that's benefit in itself.
Okay. Shouldn't we, the question here from Chance, shouldn't we promote an integration of livestock as our fifth principle of soil health? In other words, getting those microbes from the livestock incorporated into those principles?
And if you want to learn about that, next Tuesday we have an excellent presentation from Jay Fuhrer, who's going to be talking about that very subject. A great segue into that. And yes, I do. I think we should be, but I'm also a realist and realize once the pigs leave the farm, it's hard to get them back. And most livestock producers do it because they make money, but there's an attachment there. And a lot of farmers don't have that attachment anymore. So, yeah, it should be done, but it's going to be done on a huge scale. I would question that. Okay,
this is more of a philosophical question about maybe trying to promote soil health. The question deals with, how can we promote this in the marketplace so that it kind of gets some notoriety and some support economically as well?
Well, that's a good question. I think one thing we can do is, work with our agribusinesses. I think you brought up I don't know if you mentioned that. Did you talk about the furrow, Mark? I know we talked.
Not online though. It was.
Yeah. Well, why don't you talk about that? That's an excellent. I mean, you think we aren't having an effect? That's your story. Go ahead and tell us. It's a good story.
Yeah, well, and maybe many of you have seen it. The last couple editions of the Furrow, which is basically a publication that John Deere puts out, really has some very nice articles on cover crops, soil health, the microbiology of the soil, and very, very good articles with a lot of good, names of top researchers across the country that. I just think it's kind of nice to know that the word's getting out when we've got implement dealers that are kind of taking this on in their publications as well.
Yeah, and again, as far as promoting it, I think as professional conservationists, the more we understand the principles that I talked about and how they can apply, I don't think we need to be the ones that figure out how the best seeding methods. We need to be familiar with that. But we need to be able to explain the principles, explain why they're beneficial. Farmers will figure it out. They are not afraid. I can remember a supervisor he had bought a brand new sprayer, cost him $80,000. The first time I saw it, he was straddling the thing with a blowtorch because he felt he could improve it. That's my point. Farmers aren't afraid to try things if they believe in it, so we need to convince them that these principles are applicable and beneficial. And the bottom line is they'll pay them money. I mean, we could sit here and talk about examples from Pennsylvania to California and Maine to New Mexico of farmers that have benefited their bottom line by improving their soil health and reaping those soil function benefits that I talked about.
Well, I've got a little bit after 3 at this point, David. There are still quite a few questions that I will try to capture and put them into an email to you. I don't know if there's anything we need to do in the way of housekeeping as I know there are some questions about, where this be recorded. It is recorded, obviously, but where will they have access to the slide presentation and things like that?
Okay. And I will stop this and turn it over to Holly. Yep.
Well,
how do I do that, Holly? Well, I'll let Emily do it because I'm obviously not doing a very good job.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting on that, I would like to thank Mark Scarpiti, who did just an excellent job as our guest moderator today. I think that we'll be calling on Mark again someday soon, and hopefully he would be willing to give us a hand. I appreciate it a lot, Mark. And thank you also, David, for your excellent presentation. And I'm sure you'll start getting some calls and for more information on soil health management systems. Emily, are we wrapped up then with any questions that may have come in from the audience?
I have not seen any hands go up.
All right, then. Well, I think with our thanks to Mark and our thanks to David and always our thanks to Emily, who is a joy to work with AT&T, this is Holly Kirkendall, and I think we can sign off today. We appreciate everyone's attendance. Thank you very much.